Welcome to Groovy Grab Bag, Volume 6. Don't worry, I will not be speaking in this voice for the entirety of the episode. It's just spooky month, and I'm trying to get everyone in the mood for some spookiness. Okay, I really gotta stop that. That's driving me nuts. Okay, in case you couldn't understand me because of the shakiness in my voice, this is Groovy Grab Bag Volume 6. In this show, I have a bunch of albums that I listen to over the course of a month, and then I rank them from worst to best based off of my enjoyments. Everything in this episode was listened to in the month of August of 2024 because each episode takes me about 2 months to complete. To add to the gimmick, I always have one artist of whom I cover the entire discography of. In this episode, that is legendary goth musician Chelsea Wolfe. In case you didn't notice, the theme is Spooky Month, and of course I selected as many spooky albums as I possibly could, but there are some selections on here that fit more under what I call the blockbuster releases, which are the recent releases done by major artists, or artists that at least I consider major, that aren't going to necessarily fit the theme, but I listen to them to kind of be aware of the current cultural musical zeitgeist, if you will. Let's go ahead and get this thing started because I got a lot to talk about and a lot of ground to cover. Number 29, Perverse Recollections of a Necromangler by Waking the Cadaver. Alright, last month I listened to nothing but bad music because I just really wanted to start to tip the scales in my average rating by having some C's, D's, and F's in there. And back during that episode, I listened to what I thought was the worst album I'd ever heard in my life. Ladies and gentlemen, this thing's somehow even worse. So for those of you that aren't giant music nerds or weren't part of hardcore music scenes in the late 2000s, Waking the Cadaver is considered one of the worst bands of that ilk. But they go under what they call slam death metal, or some people are labeling it as deathcore. This was the band that all of the scene kids could get together and just universally revile because of just the general lack of quality and complete and utter edginess behind these guys. Now, generally speaking, I'm not the biggest fan of slam death metal because it just sounds like a bunch of gurgling and pounding away at the drums. But generally speaking, I can kind of tell what they're going for, and there's a certain level of skill and aptitude in what they're doing. Waking the Cadaver has none of that. First off, let's talk about what this band has going for it music. I'm just kidding. There is nothing to offer musically from these guys. Look, I listened to this thing 3 times and I tried to come up with something nice to say and I got nothing. At least with other slam death metal bands, you can kind of compliment the drumming skills or maybe the complicated guitar melodies. This particular era of Waking the Cadaver just sounds like a goddamn mess. First off, the only musician that seems to have any level of skill behind him is the drummer. And even he just seems to be pounding away at the toms so aggressively that this doesn't feel so much like a slam death metal album as it does like you're being pelted with a bunch of dodgeballs. I know these guys have the maturity of high schoolers, but why are they bringing their high school trauma into the mix? It's just weird. And let's talk about those bass lines, because unlike Meghan Trainor, this band is not all about that bass. First off, you can't fucking hear the bass on this thing. Did he even bother to play? Because I don't even know what the bass lines are. Either that or he's just playing along with the bass drum, which means he's gonna get lost in the mix. There's a frequent joke that's said when it comes to reviewing this album that the bass is playing below the threshold of human hearing, but to the best of my knowledge, the bass is not an instrument that is capable of doing that, so stop making that joke. Oh, but what about the guitars? Maybe we have some complicated guitar Nope. No, we don't. The guitar's just playing these little crunchy chords. Do you like Captain Crunch? Because this is crunchier than Captain Crunch. Melodies? What fucking melodies? It's just doing whatever random noodling it thinks sounds badass at the time. But what about the vocals? Maybe the vocals have something to offer, right? Nope, not them either. These aren't vocals. Somebody just recorded themselves gargling Listerine for 5 hours. You can't understand a damn word he's saying, but let's just make it clear that it's a good thing you can't. Because if you end up looking into those lyrics, it's just filled to the brim with racism and misogyny. And not in that typical sense that a lot of metal bands like to use those themes in order to speak against racism and misogyny, but rather in an attempt to be edgy for the sake of being edgy. You see that album cover right there? That's basically all you need to understand about this band. Unnecessarily violent, no actual point to be made in the music itself, and all it does is just make you feel like you were a worse person for having listened to it. When you hear a 52-second long track of the band just getting high off their ass, you know that these guys did not give a shit about the quality of this album. Now, I'm not enough of a fan of this music to have really done my homework and listened to the more recent albums, but allegedly they've gotten better and they're kind of ashamed of this era of their careers. But for a first impression, this doesn't leave so much of a brutal feeling as it does leave you the vibes of that kid in school who tried to scare everyone by bringing his gun to class, but he got stopped by security at the entrance and sent to the principal's office and went home. Nobody wins in this situation. F-. Number 28, Popular Monster by Falling in Reverse. Stop, go back. Music peaked in 1968 with the Beatles. The boomers were right, modern music was a fucking mistake. Look, I don't actually feel that way, but this album makes me tempted to feel that way. Now, I want to make this clear. In the previous video, I talked about how I was just a little too old for most of the scene bands to really be nostalgic for me. So I wasn't really there to listen to Falling in Reverse at the height of their fame. But I gotta tell ya, it had to have been better than this fucking mess of an album. Now, unlike Waking the Cadaver, Falling in Reverse seemed like a band of competent musicians. So there are thick orchestrations sprinkled all throughout this album. I'm sorry, did I say sprinkled? I mean slathered. To go with my good old sandwich metaphors, imagine that your partner's making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for you. They don't just put a thin little layer of peanut butter on it. No, it's this big old wall of peanut butter. It's just quite a bit overwhelming, wouldn't you say? These guys are trying to sound big and epic and brooding. And if you listen to this on Spotify, all of those little visualizers that they use try to give like this big, brooding, gothic image. They're so serious, guys. And then the fact that this album is another victim of the loudness war, which is a whole other thing that I could make a whole video on but won't because it'll just take too long. I'm assuming that most of you watching this probably know what I'm talking about. Now, I understand with it being the year of our Lord 2024 and complaining about the loudness is just kind of redundant, but in this case the already overwhelming elements combined with the fact that it's just completely brick wall makes it all the more noticeable. The clipping, all of the clipping, it gets to be pretty fucking egregious. But that's not even the biggest flaw with this album. Oh no. All of that weight rests on the shoulders of one Ronnie Radke. Now, Ronnie on paper is a pretty skilled vocalist. He's pretty good at rapping, he has a good sense of intonation, but his brooding, tortured soul is just on display here. Not just in his vocal performance, but in those goddamn lyrics too. He is just complaining out the wazoo about cancel culture. Cancel culture. Cancel culture. It's always me being canceled on the Twitter spaces and the MySpace page. And that perspective is just for the fucking birds, Ronnie. The boomers don't try to make themselves look as crucified as you do. Ronnie's just putting himself up on that cross, dying for humanity's sins, and nobody asked him to. All of this culminates in the album's final track, which is a cover of Papa Roach's Last Resort. Now look, I'm not a fan of the original, but even I have to admit that I can see the appeal behind it. It's the release of this aggressive, visceral energy. You can definitely see why that song is considered important to a lot of people. So what does Falling in Reverse do with it? They turn it into an epic, loud, brooding, artistic, emotional piece. Ronnie is clearly trying to show how much he's bleeding for his art, when at the end of the day it just ends up leaving the impact of a fart in a pool. Maybe some people will notice that it's warm, but eventually everyone's just gonna forget about it. Look, this album thinks it's more important than it really is, and it's just a pretentious fucking mess. It's laughable that Ronnie Radke is trying to sue multiple critics, including Anthony Fantano. It's like, Ronnie, nobody is like defaming your character when they're literally just stating the truth. This man has made multiple transphobic remarks. Despite his attempts to try to cater to the left, it feels like he in no way actually aligns with our belief systems, which is what people complain about him for. And on this album, he's complaining about the people complaining about him. Look, this isn't worth checking out. Just make yourself like a classic 1990s toy and skip it. Number 27, Witchcraft Destroys Minds and Reaps Souls by Coven. Man, for how influential this thing turned out to be, I thought it would be a lot more interesting than it ended up being. So let's talk about the background facts to explain why this album is so interesting. It's one of the earliest examples in American popular music where the lyrics explore dark themes of witchcraft and Satanism. This is actually the earliest example of the classic metal horns that have been used. This album ended up getting pulled from store shelves after it accidentally got associated with the Manson family murders, and it didn't get an actual CD pressing until the 2000s. This thing was in high demand, and the original vinyl pressings for this album continued to command a pretty fucking penny. This reputation makes the album sound like it's gonna be more interesting than it ends up being. What should and could have been a spooky, eerie album ends up sounding like a more run-of-the-mill 1960s era psych pop album. The lyrics themselves are more interesting than anything that's going on musically. I do gotta say, I appreciate the historical references being made here, as well as some accurate depictions of Satanism. Jinx Dawson's voice is pretty decent, but overall, there's just no memorable melodies from the guitars. The instrumentation, while passable, just isn't going to blow you away. And this thing ends with a 13-minute long satanic mass, with very little, if any, musical elements. It doesn't feel like something that is designed to scare you as much as it does feel like you just walked in on a bunch of your weird friends doing a weird occultist thing. Overall, it's just an underwhelming, middling experience. You can go ahead and skip this one as well, C-. Number 26, Apocalypsis by Chelsea Wolfe. Alright, so these lower ranking Chelsea Wolfe albums are a little bit frustrating for me because overall, I don't have anything all too interesting to say. As you'll see later, I like Chelsea, if not downright love her at her best. And this was her second album, and the album that started making a name for her, to the point where enough people seemed to like it to even regard it as her best. However, this was back when Chelsea Wolfe was still kind of doing these understated, artsy-fartsy, folksy sort of songs. There's a lot of intentionally sloppy, messy, reverb-drenched guitar work on here. but there seems to be a lack of a critical foundation to really tie everything together. There's not much of a rhythm section going on. Chelsea Wolfe's lyrics, while existential and horrifying, are at a bit of a low on this one, and it's just a bit too tortured and quiet for its own good. And Chelsea is at her best when she's tortured, but also there needs to be some gut-wrenching musicality going on. And I don't like Chelsea at her more understated efforts. And this is her weakest effort in that regard. C+. Number 25, Short and Sweet by Sabrina Carpenter. Boy, oh boy, this one just came out of the fucking left field. Look, I usually use like a list of upcoming releases to determine what's a blockbuster release and what isn't. In this month, for some reason, I missed a Smashing Pumpkins release, but this one almost caught me entirely by surprise until a friend of mine asked me why it wasn't on the list of upcoming albums with all the hits that this album was scoring. And me, as somebody who doesn't pay attention to the radio, just ended up saying, I guess I'm gonna have to throw it onto my list of upcoming albums that I'm gonna review. And don't get me wrong, this album is full of some bangers. Espresso, definitely one of the songs of the summer, if you ask me. And there were reviews all over the place on this, with tons and tons of people being disappointed by it. A 2 out of 5 on Sputnik Music. Look, I'm not the biggest fan of this album, but that is just a little overdramatic if you ask me. I do see where the flaws are on this. While there are some fun, bubbly songs on here, vocally, Sabrina seems to be trying to ride the coattails of Taylor Swift here and there. There's just a little bit too much country pop, which she's not really good at pulling off. Those more acoustic ballads are just kind of forgettable, if you ask me. But what's most annoying when it comes to this album are the lyrics. And I want to make it clear, I am a feminist. I try not to be super sensitive about songs that are not written with me in mind. They're meant to kind of tarnish the fragile male ego. I get it. But also at the same time, coming from Sabrina Carpenter, a lot of these moments feel a little performative. You hear Beyonce rip into a man, you know she's fucking ripping into him. But when Sabrina does it, it seems like it's done with the illicit purpose of kind of feeding into the trend. And trendy feminism isn't real feminism in a lot of cases. It's not so egregious that it makes the album bad, but it does take an album that could have been a B+ and turned it into a B-. It's not as bad as some of those critics are making it out to be, but it is somewhat disappointing in a few of its elements. Number 24, Abyss by Chelsea Wolfe. Alright, I know Chelsea Wolfe fans are watching this and probably shaking their heads thinking I'm goddamn crazy, but I'm not the biggest fan of this thing. This thing charts like really high on fan favorite albums. For some fans, this is the best Chelsea Wolfe album. But the more I listened to this and tried to process it, the less I really got out of it. After Pain is Beauty, which is a much more elaborately produced album, Chelsea Wolfe stripped things back down to their bare bones, a la her first 2 recordings. There's still electronic elements here. It's not completely stripped back down to the way that Apocalypsis is, but it's just minimalistic enough that it doesn't quite grip me from start to finish. I'm not a big fan of subtlety, and I know that that rubs a lot of people the wrong way. Subtle albums take multitudes of listens for them to fully grow on me, and each of these albums I only give 3 listens to. I will say that the lyrics, again, are existential and just completely full of dread, and if there's one thing that Chelsea's always gonna deliver on, it's both her vocals and her lyrics. But I can't name too many songs that I ended up taking home with me off of this thing. It's better than Apocalypsis, but for me, just wish it threw everything at the wall like the upcoming better albums do. B. Number 23, Flight B741 by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. Man, if there is one band that a lot of people have not shut the fuck up about in the last 10 years, it is 21 Pilots and these guys. However, unlike 21 Pilots, there's actually a lot of King Giz songs that I can get behind. Look, these guys release multiple albums per year, and they're not all going to be bangers. But it feels like the more they release in any given year, the less consistently good those albums are. Now, this album isn't bad at all, but I really wanted to point out that problem when it comes to King Giz. There's some really nice 1960s pop psychedelia going on here. What I really like is that this thing sounds like it was recorded in the 1960s, where they were realizing, oh crap, we can create a concept around an album. Guys, this is revolutionary. It definitely has that sense of wonder going for it. I really fucking appreciate that. This is a fun album at the very least. And the musicianship, I mean, it's fucking King Gizzard. But ultimately, it just feels like an album paying homage to an era that has nothing new to really offer the listener. And once the gimmick kind of wears off, it's just like, alright, well, that was good. What of it? This is my first listen to a King Giz album, and I'm sure that I'm in for a treat with some of the better albums. And it's not a bad first impression, but it's also not the best first impression. B. Number 22, Stampede by Orville Peck. Man, when Gay Dwight Yoakam released that A+ pony back in 2019, I just knew, deep in my heart, that this man has an S tier in him. Then in 2022, he released Bronco with some of the best country singles released in years, holy hell. And then you listen to the album and it just ends up being a B. And this year, he released Stampede, which is a collection of duets. Surely this is gonna be the album where Orville finally gives me that S-tier album I've been craving from him, right? Right? Let's make this clear, there are some moments on here that work very well. Listening to Orville sing a gay cowboy song with the 90-plus-year-old Willie Nelson is just out of this world. The song he did with Beck is probably one of the best songs that has featured Beck in the last 20 years. And all of those new faces that he does songs with, man, I got a bunch of names that are on my radar now. He works with people of many different diversities, and that is something to really admire him for on here. However, not everything sticks. Some of these songs are just run-of-the-mill country songs with forgettable melodies. The track with Kylie Minogue, as much as I'm a gigantic Kylie Minogue stan, just features Kylie doing that kind of whispered, seductress voice. I don't know what it is, but when she does that whispered, kind of more monotone sort of melodies, it just does not catch my ear. And the cover of Saturday Night's Alright for Fighting with Elton John. Why did you even bother? It sounds like the instruments are trying to fire at all cylinders, but none of the cylinders are actually running. It's like somebody forgot to start the vehicle to begin with. You might as well have just recorded Orville and Elton in adjacent stalls having a casual conversation in the bathroom. It would have been more compelling than that. It's a mixed bag with some really great moments on it and some moments that definitely shouldn't have been on the cutting room floor to begin with. B. Number 21, The Grime and the Glow by Chelsea Wolfe. This one's gonna be quick. This is a charming first album by Chelsea Wolfe. Yes, I know I complained about Apocalypsis being a messy, sloppy album, and this one's even sloppier. But there's a certain charm to this. Something about just going into the studio, messing around, seeing what kind of eerie vibes you can pick up. The lack of structure to these songs actually honestly makes the messiness a little bit better than on Apocalypsis. The fact that this isn't trying to make some sort of big, dark message ends up working to its favor. It may not be as captivating or as epic as some of her larger scale releases, but I ended up liking this one pretty decently. Especially the song Serenum Scorpuli, which put a fucking chill down my spine because it has those layered vocals. I'm glad I listened to it. B. Number 20, Their Satanic Majesty's Requests by the Rolling Stones. And the award for least spooky album of the month goes to, well, still Waking the Cadaver, but this is a close follow-up. You think with a title like that you would have an album that sounds spooky and menacing in some way, right? But no, that's not the case at all. The Rolling Stones were chasing trends around this time and were trying to kind of replicate Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. A little birdie told them about the musical direction that Sgt. Pepper was taking, so they kind of tried to beat Sgt. Pepper to the punch. But instead of ending up being one of the most cherished albums of all time, you have an album that's well liked by quite a few Stones fans, and a couple of songs that are part of the greatest Rolling Stones songs ever recorded, especially songs like She Comes in Colors. However, this is before the Rolling Stones just started doing what they do best, which is balls to the wall heavy rock. This ain't no Exile, this ain't no Sticky Fingers. This is the Rolling Stones getting artistic and atmospheric and not knowing what to do with those elements. These drones that go on for just too goddamn long. There's no variation in what's going on sonically for me to want to revisit a lot of these tracks. I don't really buy that the Rolling Stones were into this big new agey image that they were trying to conjure. All I can really say is that I'm glad I listened to it for the sake of getting some origins of those classic songs and put them into context. But other than that, it's a B. Number 19, Self-Surgery by Miss Piss. And the award for worst band name of the month goes to, well, still Waking the Cadaver if I'm being honest. But Miss Piss comes in a close second. Miss Piss is a collaboration between Chelsea Wolfe, which is the reason why I'm reviewing it here, and legendary punk musician Jess Gowrie. Both of them are ardent feminists, both of them get along very well, and this album is a blend between Jess's brilliantly done aggressive punk and Chelsea's watching the blood seeping from the walls level of gothic rock. At less than 20 minutes, this thing packs a punch and then leaves before it's done beating you up. And unfortunately, this is one of those albums that you want to beat you up. Like, god damn it, you didn't even take my lunch money, girls. I just wish it was a bit longer because this was really good. Maybe they'll work together again and give us a second album that's a little bit longer, but because of this thing's length and just me longing to hear more of it, I just gotta give it a B+. Number 18, La Sexorcito, Devil Music, Volume 1 by White Zombie. What a fitting band to be part of a spooky month, right? So White Zombie, for those that are unaware, was the origin band that Rob Zombie came from. Their first couple of albums from the 1980s sounded like shit. Just a lack of polish, a lack of any sort of focus in the songwriting. So they hired Andy Wallace and started honing their craft quite a bit more. And this thing is a pretty gosh darn solid album. First off, I gotta give credit to whoever did all the sampling work on here, because these are all used fucking perfectly. Lining them up with the lyrics, perfectly producing them so that way they don't become the centerpiece of the song, using them to build up on those eerie, spooky vibes. And of course, the star of the show is not Rob Zombie, surprisingly, but bassist Sean Isolt. I don't know how to pronounce that, I apologize. This is a groove metal album, so you better have a damn good bassist behind the wheel, and she's one of the best in the fucking genre. Honestly, I want to check out more of the stuff that she's done than anything else that Rob's done. Because while Rob isn't necessarily a bad vocalist, he is definitely a one-trick pony. Look, the sort of gimmick just gets old after like the third or fourth time that you hear it on here. His lyrics are fine, it's just the delivery is just so repetitive. It causes some of these songs to feel a little samey. And at almost an hour long, you definitely need a little bit of variation. And the instrumentals do give us some of that. But I do feel like somebody could have come in here with a pair of editing scissors and made a very solid album just a little bit under 50 minutes. And of course, this thing features Iggy Pop on one of the tracks, back before Iggy Pop was known as a giant fucking creep. Oh wait, he's not widely known as a giant fucking creep, because most people haven't read Please Kill Me. Just read Please Kill Me, you'll see why he's a giant fucking creep. While his appearance and some of the repetitiveness does drag this album down quite a bit, I do feel like this was worth checking out. B+. Number 17, Scary Monsters and Super Creeps by David Bowie. Mr. Bowie and me, I have a complicated opinion about him. On one level, the Berlin trilogy is pretty fucking excellent, Heroes being one of my all-time favorite albums. On the other, Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars just does nothing for me. With Bowie, I either really like it and agree with the audiences, or I don't really see eye to eye. This is slightly more in that latter camp. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some stellar songs on here. Fashion, the title track, that more post-punk bass-driven style on here is really a treat to hear at times. You could definitely tell Brian Eno left his mark on Bowie because there's some atmospheric synth lines on here. But I really don't feel like some of these songs are as effective as some of the die-hard David Bowie fans want you to believe. It's a good album, but 5 out of 5 stars, no. B+. Number 16, The Birth of Violence by Chelsea Wolfe. Man, with a title like that, I would expect something a lot more intense than what I got. What I got wasn't bad, mind you, but this was definitely a lot calmer than I was anticipating. This is a callback once again to Chelsea's folksy roots. But out of all of her folksy albums, I think this is the strongest one. Which is a controversial statement to make because for a lot of fans, this is her worst. It does have a much more polished indie pop production behind it. Taking a few steps back from those blood seeping from the walls gothic production was probably a moment of catharsis for Chelsea. I do appreciate the sonic diversity that Chelsea has to give us. I also felt like these songs were a lot more emotionally captivating than on Apocalypsis or Abyss. Call me a plebeian, but sometimes giving that much more polished pop production and having a bit more of a structure behind it can go a long ways to an album's quality. It's not perfect, I definitely see where some of the flaws are showing, especially with the fact that this album does feel like it plays it a bit too safe, but I am glad I overall listened to it. B+. Number 15, Welcome to My Nightmare by Alice Cooper. As someone who lives in the state of Arizona, Alice Cooper is ingrained into my retinas. I have seen him and heard his voice everywhere. And of course I am aware that he is also a boomer with some really bad takes. This album was Cooper's first solo attempt. More storytelling and experimentation in the world of shock rock and metal. The stage shows for this thing were elaborate, and just like the stage shows, these songs are elaborate in many ways. This tells the story of a young boy with his various nightmares. One of the songs, called The Black Widow in particular, is about the boy's fear of spiders. Vincent Price comes in and does this really menacing monologue in the middle of it. This man who wants to make the entire world a legion of spiders. But not that lame 1997 Lost in Space remake villain sort of thing. Those of you that noticed that I was doing the wobbling back and forth Doug Walker style. There's a lot of lyrics about familial trauma and hallucinations. This boy conjures up some really goddamn frightening images. And while the theatrics are absolutely stellar on here, with some really intense moments, stylistically speaking, strangely enough, this thing doesn't sound far removed from Billy Joel or Elton John. Maybe with just the use of a few more minor chords and a little bit more distortion in the guitar. Other than that, it kind of fits in like a glove with the time period. I'm not completely complaining about that, I just wish there was a bit more meat on the bones in that regard. I appreciate the importance this thing has in the world of metal and shock rock, but when it comes down to it, it's not as interesting as some people claim it is. B+. Number 14, The Number of the Beast by Iron Maiden. While I'm at it, let's just go ahead and piss off more metalheads, shall we? This is considered the Iron Maiden experience to listen to, and it has some of the pinnacle moments of the Iron Maiden catalog. That title track, man, that fucking title track. Bruce Dickinson as a vocalist just fucking kills it all throughout here. The song Run for the Hills was my favorite off of this album. I had no idea that that song is actually about indigenous trauma. That adds some additional layers onto this thing. And the musicianship is just great all throughout this album. I actually don't dislike any of these songs at all. As a matter of fact, I almost wanted to give this thing a higher rating just for the songwriting and the performance alone. However, for me, the biggest problem comes with the production. See, there's not a whole lot of reverb on here. A lot of the instruments just sound really dry, which sucks because there is just so much going on here. And I get it, that's part of the reason why some people like this. But I like my music with a bit more of effects on it. It sounds like there's not really a room that this is being performed in, which causes a lot of the instrumentation to sound a little muffled and flat in some places. The bassist is firing on all cylinders, the drummer is magnificently talented, the guitarist is one of the best in the entire metal genre. I just wish that they did more sonically with this thing. People forget exactly how important production is in an album's sound quality. Overall, I'm still really fucking glad I listened to this, but I wish I could give it a higher rating than I currently do, with it sitting at an A-. Number 13, She Reaches Out to She by Chelsea Wolfe. And the worst album title of the month goes out to, well, if I'm being honest, still Waking the Cadaver. But this comes in a close second. Now, this thing was praised out the absolute wazoo when it was released earlier this year, and honestly, I can see why. This is a combination between Chelsea Wolfe's more folksy, artsy side and the electronic elements that she started experimenting around with during Pain is Beauty. However, this is probably her most electronic. The minimalism is still present on here, but she balances it out with some interesting soundscapes. And while I don't personally see it as Chelsea's magnum opus, I definitely appreciate her mixing things up by Trent Reznor-ing her style up just ever so slightly. Clearly it worked in her benefit, though critics love the absolute hell out of this thing. Also, the use of reverb on her voice is probably at its peak here. The nihilistic lyrics are more nihilistic than they ever been on a Chelsea Wolfe release. I wish there was just a bit more oomph behind it, but overall, I can see why people love this thing so much. A-. Number 12, 6 Feet Under by Gravediggaz. Man, spooky Wu-Tang Clan over here gave me a really pleasant surprise. See, the genre horrorcore tends to conjure images of fucking ICP. They've come to dominate the movement, but we forget that horrorcore has been whitewashed over the years. While this wasn't the first in the genre, it did help cement a lot of the tropes that were later explored. Now, strangely enough, this probably has more in common with Wu-Tang Clan than it does Insane Clown Posse. Just like Wu-Tang Clan, there's a cast of characters. They each has their own particular shtick and personality. However, this has a bit more of a layer of violence and horror theming to it, with metaphors that are used to compare elements of horror movies and horror novels with the suffering of people of color in the 1990s. The way the monsters in horror are ridiculed by general society mirrors how black people were treated as potential criminals by police and upper-class white individuals. There's definitely a lot of real pain and suffering that's felt here. The beats are stellar, even if they are just a tad dated with those vinyl scratches that have gotten old by this point. The satire and lyrical themes are absolute genius, and I can definitely see why this is considered to be a hip-hop classic. Though there's a bit of a lack of musical innovation, I gotta appreciate this thing. A-. Number 11, Gree Gree by Dr. John the Night Tripper. Yeah, I know later he just went by Dr. John, but I think he should have kept the Night Tripper, because that just makes him sound fucking badass. This is a really cool spooky release right here. One of the 2 R&B albums on here. This is more Bayou voodoo horror than anything. Dr. John's very limited range actually ends up working in his favor on here. The production on this thing is so goddamn dirty that if Dr. John was a teenage boy and this album were his room and his mother were to come in and say, "No more video games until you clean your room," Dr. John would turn around and say, "Hey, sweet mama, cut a cool cat some slack, will ya?" And then his mother would say, "Oh, you rascal, okay, but you better clean your room by the end of the week." Now I know what you're thinking, what the hell was up with that analogy, Randy? And I'm just saying, man, give this thing a listen and you'll get exactly what I'm saying. A. Number 10, Blood Moon 1 by Converge and Chelsea Wolfe. Man, it's been a while since I talked about Converge, hasn't it? Last time we talked about Converge was 2 whole presidents ago. Now, I listened to this because it's a Chelsea Wolfe album, but it's not so much a Chelsea Wolfe album as it is a Converge album featuring Chelsea Wolfe very heavily. Now, some evil villain came up with this idea, and you know it, because Converge is one of the most consistently good bands out there. I mean, album after album just getting critically praised. You guys can release a bad album, please. And then Chelsea Wolfe being on her fucking A-game. You just expect this thing to be one of the greatest albums ever recorded. So why is it at number 10 and not, say, in the top 5? Okay, first off, this is an absolutely fucking amazing album in many ways. Converge and Chelsea go together like the best goddamn peanut butter and jelly sandwich you have ever eaten in your whole fucking life. The peanut butter is perfectly crunchy or creamy depending on your preference. The jelly is applied perfectly, you don't make a mess out of yourself. Steve Bannon's screamed vocals actually go very well with Chelsea Wolfe's tortured, honest voice. The combination of those hardcore elements and Chelsea Wolfe's bleeding from the goddamn walls goth rock works so well together, and there's not a bad track on here. However, the expectations I had did this album no favors. This album is absolutely great, but something about this album just trying to make itself to be even better than it already was ended up holding it back. Just so much ambition thrown here, and they didn't let the album kind of breathe and make itself good on its own. Something about it just trying so hard, it's kind of difficult to put my finger on exactly why I feel this way. Do I recommend you listen to it? Yes. Would I say that it's one of the best albums of the past 5 years? No. A. Number 9, Heresy by Universe Zero. Just Universe Zero if you really don't want to be fucking pretentious and try to say it with a Swedish accent. Psst. Hey kid, you want to listen to an artsy album that takes more inspiration from 20th century classical music than it does rock? It was called Rock and Opposition, kid. Half these songs are about the Jack the Ripper killings, and not a single one of them has any vocals on them. But it is intense, let me tell you, and worth checking out. Kid, you gotta be careful though, because those haunting atmospheres, they're gonna spook you out. It's said that this is one of the most cursed albums ever recorded, and while that urban myth sounds more like a shitty chainmail than any sort of truth, I gotta say, with how fucking intense this thing gets, you definitely believe that some people may have been cursed by it. Don't ask where I got it from, kid, probably the depths of hell or something, but this gets an eye. Number 8's Wild God by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. I was going to review Murder Ballads, but no, Nick Cave had to release an album in August, and I wasn't going to review 2 Nick Cave albums. So, I get to review this one instead. But you know what, it's at number 8, and yeah, no, I'm fucking glad I listened to this thing. How the hell has Nick Cave been so consistently good? This is such a pretty fucking album. Probably his most joyous. I really appreciate the use of gospel singers on here backing him up. The lyrics are told from the perspective of a god observing humanity, or something so other, because it's really hard to decipher what some of these deeply fried metaphors actually mean. But at 66 years old, Cave is still giving us some of his best material. Out of all the blockbuster albums from this month, this was the biggest surprise. Number 7, Pain is Beauty by Chelsea Wolfe. Man, oh man, I was not expecting to like this one as much as I did. This is Chelsea at her most emotional. Pulling away from the minimalistic compositions and diving straight into electronic atmospheres. With the exception of one album that's coming up on my list, this is probably the thickest instrumentation that you'll ever get out of Chelsea. And while Chelsea never writes from personal experience, this album feels like it was written from a personal place. This album is about 2 doomed lovers that are in denial, desperate to see their relationship through, even though they know they are wrong for each other. The insecurities, the pain, the desperation to keep themselves together, completely knocked off their ass by life's existential inevitability. Eventually, they do separate. This is a very real thing that people go through. They know the relationship is doomed, but they can't help but try to keep it going anyways. It's such a human thing. Not to mention all the absolutely beautiful melodies on here. The piano is just so masterfully well worked in here. Just give this thing a listen. Probably one of the biggest surprises I had this month. A+. Number 6, The Divine Punishment by Diamanda Galez. You know what really sucks? Losing a sibling that you're close to. You know what sucks even more? Losing that sibling to an awful disease. You know what sucks even more than that? Losing that sibling to an awful disease and the government not giving a fuck about the fact that they were a member of an ostracized group of people and being completely buried. Gallus lost her brother to AIDS. Prior to this, she was already pretty well known in a lot of avant-garde circles. She's known for her very confrontational and difficult music. But this is considered to be her magnum opus, and for a good reason. Part of a trilogy of albums written in tribute to her brother, this album is a very heavy listen, with constant chants and vocalizations that completely throw you off your rocker. Diamanda doesn't so much use her voice as an instrument as she does a method of torture throughout this album. Guttural, grunts, high-pitched creaking noises. This woman does things with her voice that absolutely ache with anger, justified anger at that. The use of biblical verses in English, Latin, and Italian all add to the bitter message behind this album. Diamanda was hurting deeply, and she wanted to make sure that nobody else would have to hurt. This album is historically important just as much as it is an audio feast. It is not an easy listen. It is an absolutely ugly album, but it is a necessary listen. If you haven't already, give this thing a shot, but don't expect it to go down easy. A+. Number 5, Hiss Spun by Chelsea Wolfe. All throughout this video, I have been saying that Chelsea Wolfe at her best is like blood seeping from the walls, and this is the album that perfectly personifies that. This is thick as balls production. This is so fucking heavy that the strongest man in the world could try to lift it and would probably end up sinking into the ground in his efforts. The reverb slathered guitars, the doom metal elements, they are all there. Chelsea Wolfe is at her most nihilistic on here. That's one word I kept forgetting to use in these prior entries. The nihilism in Chelsea's music is part of what carries it. This constant sense of dread, and this is her most dreadful album. Just like Pain is Beauty, there are lyrics about insecurity, about uncertainty in life, and this thing can sound absolutely helpless at its best moments. While some of my favorite existential albums end up trying to be uplifting by the end, this album doesn't have the goal of uplifting. It has the goal of leaving you lost in that sense of helplessness. And sometimes we need that. It's not done with the sense of trying to give you a sense of helplessness in life. It's done with a sense of empathy, that sometimes there's not going to be a positive answer. And if we're going to be in a moment of pain, we might as well writhe in that pain. Every single song on here absolutely works, and I was almost tempted to give this thing an S tier. And while it doesn't necessarily hit the heights of my S tier albums on this list, I still highly recommend it. A+. Number 4, Primary Colors by The Horrors. You know, there's this thing that certain shoegaze circles likes to say exists called dark gaze. It's shoegaze that is more influenced by post-punk than it is dream pop. And yes, I know dream pop is a subgenre that was started under the guise of post-punk, but a lot of people would argue that dark gaze doesn't exist. It's just shoegazing with a bit more of a rhythmic feel, more of a presence in the bass, the overt use of baritone and bass vocalists. But I would argue that there are elements that dark gaze albums have that a lot of other post-punk records don't necessarily have. There tends to be this focus on overwhelming the listener with noise. Whereas a lot of shoegazing can be noisy in and of itself, there's this sense of beauty to juxtapose with that noise. Whereas dark gazing focuses a lot more on darker vibes. The Horrors were a band that started off as kind of a theatrical post-punk band. They were considered rather gimmicky for their very first album. But by the time their second album came around, the band members started realizing that you can't really build a career off of a gimmick. Not a necessarily respectable career at that. So they started playing around with effects pedals, which gave them a much more shoegazy vibe than before. The synthesizer elements on this album are absolutely stellar. There are certain moments where you think they're using a synth pedal on the guitar, but nope, that is a synthesizer hooked up to effects pedals, slathered in all of the reverb imaginable, singing angsty lyrics calling out in vain. New Ice Age is one of those songs that sticks with you, especially as I'm recording this as Hurricane Milton is pummeling Florida. Why mention that? Well, it's because it's a song about climate change. And while this isn't necessarily a spooky album, it's more angsty and depressing, it definitely still carries some of those leftover elements from the first album by The Horrors. The Horrors would start to brighten up their sound with the subsequent albums that came out after this. It would never be quite as dark and as brooding. Their sense of melody and strong choruses help them stand out from their contemporaries. Artists such as Have a Nice Life, which can get just a little bit too lost in the sauce of their own pretension, don't quite hold the same candle as bands like The Horrors. This has the best balance between pop and dark gaze that you could have asked for. And it sucks that it's not talked about in the greater pantheon of the best shoegaze albums of all time. My personal favorite dark gaze album, and I highly recommend you check it out. S. Number 3, Magdalene by FKA Twigs. You know, this was recommended to me as a spooky album, and I mean, there's spooky and disturbing moments on it, but this feels a little bit more glitchy and disjointed than it does spooky. And I mean disjointed in a good way. This thing is playing around with various electronic elements and programming sounding broken on purpose. This is a painstakingly crafted pop album, having a lot more in common sonically with Bjork than a lot of its R&B contemporaries. And do not read me wrong, this is still an R&B album. FKA Twigs has struck a lot of people as that sort of Kate Bush, Bjork, Carolyn Polachek sort of vibes mixed with those R&B elements. This thing sounds like it was made by the most empathetic alien you could ever imagine, because it's almost inhuman how perfect this thing can sound at times. The production is absolutely wonderful, not a moment of clipping in any of it. The musical change-ups between the hip-hop elements, and even some new agey moments on here. This is genre fuckery to the greatest extent. The fact that she utilizes her lower range more often than her upper register really comes to show that the human voice should not only be about how high or how powerful you can sound. And this girl's got pipes, let me tell ya. But she's also a master composer and musician. She manifests these emotions into these wild concoctions of songs. And honestly, I am looking forward to that new album coming out in January. S. Number 2, Spiderland by Slint. Last month I reviewed the very first Slint album. This month I review the one that everybody knows them for. This was the very first post-rock album. And what is post-rock? Well, Google it. I don't have time. The story behind the production on this thing is an absolute mess. Originally, this was set out to just be an instrumental album, but the single second they went into the recording booth, the record executive said, "You guys need to put vocals on this thing," which led to them having to rush writing the lyrics on this album. It also explains why there's so much spoken word on it, as there are certain moments that just wouldn't fit an actual traditional vocal line. They only had 4 days to record this album, and the recording sessions were absolutely brutal, with the producers demanding perfect takes from them. None of the band members slept during the entirety of those 4 days, having to use energy drinks to keep themselves awake. And as somebody who has been drinking way too many energy drinks this day and age, let me tell ya, that sounds absolutely awful. By the time recording wrapped up, 2 of the band members allegedly had to be institutionalized, which led people to think that it was because of the dark, brooding atmosphere of this album that they ended up getting institutionalized. But that's not the actual reason. They got institutionalized because of the stress of recording the album. That, probably combined with the general lack of sleep, will do it to you. Now, did the stress pay off? No, because no magnificent work of art is worth stressing yourself out to that extent. But this is still a masterclass album regardless. From the opening bars of Breadcrumb Trail to the despairing final moments of Good Morning Captain, this thing is perfection from start to finish. And while these songs are long, there's only 6 of them, and the album clocks in at under 40 minutes, making this less of a demanding tall order of an album to listen to. Breadcrumb Trail features this very chromatic guitar melody. and tells the story of a young man's trip to a carnival where he meets a fortune teller, and he gets bored getting his fortune read, leans in and says, "Hey girl, you want to ride the roller coaster?" And let me tell you, the roller coaster ride, it is a messy, horrifying roller coaster ride. In the vocal line, it just punches, reaching up into the sky, just putting like this perfect little roar to his voice at the right moments. After this quiet, whispered, spoken word bit, it comes out of nowhere, but in all the best ways. Then there's tracks like Nosferatu Man, which tells the story of an ugly guy. I mean, that's all there really is to it, but it's still really frightening at the end of the day, the imagery they decide to go with. And not only are some of these songs scary, some of them are just emotionally upsetting. Listen to Washer. Try not to feel absolutely fucking depressed after listening to that. And of course, this ends on the magnificent Good Morning Captain, which is about a disaster at sea and the ghosts that now haunt the ship. It's both tear-jerking and incredibly haunting at the same time. This is one of my all-time favorite albums, and I give it an S tier. But it's not the best that I listened to this month. Oh, no. Let's get to that number one. And my number one album of the month goes to When the Kite String Pops by Acid Bath. Dr. Seuss is dead. Your childhood is gone. Modern creative media is morally bankrupt. Our political world is doomed. John Wayne Gacy's final petitioned painting is staring you right in the face. The world is trash. It's ugly. Nobody is truly a good person. We are all tragic little bonfires that cannot be extinguished. This was the debut album by one of the most underrated metal bands of all time, Acid Bath. It explores some of the most ugly elements of humanity, but does so in a pretty surprisingly tasteful sort of way. These songs were first written on acoustic guitar, and then they were thrown into the process of turning them into metal songs. And a couple of them still hold their acoustic elements, but they are absolutely musically complex. Acid Bath are what we call sludge metal, which is supposed to be the combination of doom metal and hardcore punk. So you take the really thick textures that are explored in doom metal, and then you give them the sort of aggression and pace and rhythm that hardcore punk tends to have. But even Acid Bath doesn't fully fit in with their contemporaries in the genre because of how musically complex some of these compositions get. And also the lyrical themes get pretty wild as well. Screams of a Butterfly tell the story of an abortion in bloody, gruesome detail. With these guys being from Louisiana, you would think it would be because they're pro-life, but actually, no, not at all. When I talked about Brick by Ben Folds 5, I mentioned how abortion is kind of a heavy decision for women to make. And while that might not be the truth for every individual that gets an abortion, there's always that ethical questioning that a lot of people seem to put themselves through before getting the procedure. And this song talks about those moral questionings, describing the bloody mess after the fact. Is it shocking? Yes, but does it get you thinking about the issues of abortion from a pro-life stance? Yes. This band was actually surprisingly really progressive for the area that they came from. Cassie Eats Cockroaches also touches up on some really morbid themes, talking about how disgusting humanity really can be at its core. My personal favorite moment on this album is Dr. Seuss is Dead, which is an album that talks about the loss of innocence in pop culture, the fact that creativity is dying, that there seems to be no new ideas. All art has become corporatized, something that has just started to resonate more and more with each passing year. This is such a masterfully well-made album. Even at being over an hour long, you still want more by the time the finishing bars play on this thing. This band was super close-knit, and unfortunately they would only get to release 2 albums before the bassist died in an awful, tragic car accident at way too young of an age. They couldn't see themselves going without that bassist, which just goes to show you that sometimes a bond can help create a really wonderful work of art. I can't even begin to explain to you exactly how amazing this album is. It's probably my personal favorite metal album of all time. Please check this thing out. And there we have it. Spooky month. Tell me what you think about some of these albums in the comments below. Did I end up turning you on to any of these albums? Do you disagree with any of my opinions? If so, feel free to. I'd especially like to hear from some of you Chelsea Wolfe fans. Also, please do let me know if the speedier pace of this video helps at all, or if you guys prefer the pace I took the previous 2 episodes at. Thank you again for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. See ya later.